3. The Lauriston Gardens Mystery. I confess that I was considerably startled by this fresh proof of the practical nature of my companion's theories. My respect for his power of analysis increased greatly. There still remained some suspicion in my mind, however, that the whole thing was arranged with the intention to dazzle me. When I looked at him, he had finished reading the note, and his eyes had assumed that vacant expression which showed mental abstraction. "How in the world did you deduce that?" I asked.
"Deduce what?"
said he. "Why, that he was a retired sergeant of marines."
"I have no time for trifles,"
he answered. Then, with a smile, "Excuse my rudeness. You broke the thread of my thoughts, but perhaps it is as well. So you actually were not able to see that that man was a sergeant of marines?" "No, indeed." "It was easier to know it than to explain why I know it. If you were asked to prove that 2 and 2 made 4, you might find some difficulty, and yet you are quite sure of the fact. Even across the street I could see a great blue anchor tattooed on the back of the fellow's hand. That smelled of the sea. He had a military carriage, however, and side whiskers. There we have the marine. He was a man with some amount of self-importance and a certain air of command. You must have observed the way in which he held his head and carried his cane. A steady, respectable, middle-aged man, too, on the face of him, all facts which led me to believe that he had been a sergeant." "Wonderful!" I cried.
"Oh, it's easy," said Holmes,
though I thought from his expression that he was pleased at my evident surprise and admiration.
"I said just now that there were no criminals. It appears that I am wrong. Look at this."
He threw me over the note which the commissionaire had brought. "Why," I cried as I cast my eye over it, "this is terrible."
"It does seem to be a little out of the common," he remarked calmly. "Would you mind reading it to me aloud?"
This is the letter which I read to him. "My dear Mr. Sherlock Holmes, there has been a bad business during the night at 3 Lauriston Gardens, off the Brixton Road. Our man on the beat saw a light there about 2 in the morning, and as the house was an empty one, suspected that something was wrong. He found the door open, and in the front room, which has no furniture, discovered the body of a well-dressed gentleman who had cards in his pocket bearing the name of Enoch J. Drebber, Cleveland, Ohio, USA. There had been no robbery, and there is no evidence as to how the man met his death. There are marks of blood in the room, but there is no wound upon his person. We are at a loss as to how he came into the empty house. Indeed, the whole affair is a puzzler. If you can come round to the house any time before 12, you will find me there. I have left everything untouched until I hear from you. If you are unable to come, I shall give you fuller details, and would esteem it a great kindness if you would favour me with your opinion. Yours faithfully, Tobias Gregson."
"Gregson is the smartest of the Scotland Yarders," my friend remarked. "He and Lestrade are the best of a bad lot. They're both quick and energetic, but commonplace. They have their knives into one another, too. They are as jealous as a pair of professional beauties. There will be some fun over this case if they are both put on the scent."
I was amazed at the calm way in which he spoke.
"Surely there is not a moment to be lost," I cried. "Shall I go and order you a cab?" "I'm not sure about whether I shall go. I'm the most lazy devil, but I can be quick enough at times."
"Why, it is just such a chance as you've been longing for."
"My dear fellow, what does it matter to me? Supposing I solve the whole matter, you may be sure that Gregson, Lestrade and Co. will pocket all the credit, as I am an unofficial personage."
"But he begs you to help him."
"Yes, He knows that I'm his superior and acknowledges it to me, but he would cut his tongue out before he would tell it to any third person. However, we may as well go and have a look. I may have a laugh at them if I have nothing else. Come on." He put on his overcoat and fussed about in a way that showed an energetic fit had replaced the apathetic one. "Get your hat," he said. "You wish me to come?" "Yes, if you've nothing better to do." A minute later, we were both in a hansom, driving furiously for the Brixton Road. It was a foggy, cloudy morning, and a grey veil hung over the housetops, looking like the reflection of the mud-coloured streets beneath. My companion was in the best of spirits, and talked about fiddles and the difference between a Stradivarius and an Amati. As for myself, I was silent, for the dull weather and the melancholy business upon which we were engaged depressed my spirits. "You don't seem to give much thought to the matter," I said at last, interrupting Holmes' musical study. "No data yet," he answered. "It is a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It influences the judgment." "You will have your data soon," I remarked, pointing with my finger. "This is the Brixton Road, and that is the house, if I am not very much mistaken." "So it is. Stop, driver, stop!" We were still 100 yards or so from it, but he insisted upon our getting off, and we finished our journey on foot. Number 3 Lauriston Gardens had a menacing look. It was one of the 4 houses which stood back some little way from the street, 2 being occupied and 2 empty. The latter looked out with 3 rows of empty, melancholy windows, which were blank and dreary, with a "To Let" card upon the panes. A small garden with sickly plants separated each of these houses from the street. A narrow pathway, yellowish in colour, and consisting apparently of a mixture of clay and of gravel, crossed the garden. The whole place was very dirty from the rain which had fallen through the night. The garden was surrounded by a 3-foot brick wall with wood rails upon the top. A sturdy police constable was leaning against this wall. He was surrounded by a group of idle passers-by who hoped to catch some glimpse of the proceedings within. I had imagined that Sherlock Holmes would at once have hurried into the house and plunged into a study of the mystery, but it was far from his intention. With an air of indifference which, under such circumstances, seemed to me unnatural, he walked up and down the pavement and gazed vacantly at the ground, the sky, the opposite houses, and the line of railings. Having finished his examination, he went slowly down the path, or rather down the edge of grass along the path, keeping his eyes on the ground. Twice he stopped, and once I saw him smile and heard him utter an exclamation of satisfaction. There were many marks of footsteps upon the wet, clayey soil, but since the police had been coming and going over it, I was unable to see how my companion could hope to learn anything from it. Still, I had had such extraordinary evidence of the quickness of his perceptive abilities that I had no doubt that he could see a great deal which was hidden from me. At the door of the house we were met by a tall, white-faced, flaxen-haired man with a notebook in his hand, who rushed forward and shook my companion's hand with vigour. "It is indeed kind of you to come," he said. "I've had everything left untouched." "Except that," my friend answered, pointing to the pathway. "If a herd of bulls had passed along, there could not be a greater mess. No doubt, however, you had drawn your own conclusion, Gregson, before you allowed this." "I've had so much trouble to do inside the house," the detective said evasively. "My colleague, Mr. Lestrade, is here. I had relied upon him to look after this." Holmes glanced at me and raised his eyebrows sardonically. With two such men as yourself and Lestrade upon the ground, there will not be much for me to find out, he said.
Gregson rubbed his hands in a self-satisfied way. I think we have done all that can be done, he answered. It's a queer case, though, and I knew your taste for such things.
You did not come here in a cab? Asked Sherlock Holmes.
No, sir.
Nor Lestrade?
No, sir.
Then let us go and look at the room.
With this inconsequent remark, he went on into the house, followed by Gregson, whose features expressed his astonishment. A short, dusty passage led to the kitchen and offices. Two doors opened out of it to the left and to the right. One of these had obviously been closed for many weeks. The other belonged to the dining room, which was the apartment in which the mysterious affair had occurred. Holmes walked in, and I followed him with that subdued feeling at my heart which the presence of death inspires. It was a large square room, looking larger from the absence of all furniture. A vulgar paper covered the walls, but it was covered in places with mildew, and here and there great strips hung down, exposing the yellow plaster beneath. Opposite the door was a fireplace with a mantelpiece of imitation white marble. On one corner of this a red wax candle was stuck. The solitary window was so dirty that the light was hazy and uncertain, giving a dull grey colour to everything. The thick layer of dust covered the whole apartment. All these details I observed afterwards. At present, my attention was centred upon the single, grim, motionless figure which lay stretched upon the floor, with vacant, sightless eyes staring up at the discoloured ceiling. The man was about 43 or 44 years of age, middle-sized, broad-shouldered, with crisp curling black hair and a short beard. He was dressed in a heavy frock coat and waistcoat with light-coloured trousers and immaculate collar and cuffs. A top hat, well brushed and trim, was placed upon the floor beside him. His hands were clenched and his arms were thrown abroad, while his legs were interlocked, as though his death struggle had been a grievous one. On his rigid face there was an expression of horror, and, as it seemed to me, of hatred, such as I have never seen upon human features. This malignant and terrible contortion, combined with the low forehead, blunt nose, and heavy jaw, gave the dead man an ape-like appearance, which was increased by his unnatural posture. I have seen death in many forms, but never has it appeared to me in a more fearsome way than in that dark, grimy apartment in the suburbs of London. Lestrade, lean and tall, was standing by the doorway and greeted my companion and myself. "This case will make a stir, sir," he remarked. "It beats anything I have seen, and I have seen much." "There is no clue?" said Gregson. "None at all," answered Lestrade. Sherlock Holmes approached the body and, kneeling down, examined it intently. "You're sure that there is no wound?" he asked, pointing to numerous splashes of blood which lay all around. "Positive," cried both detectives. "Then, of course, this blood belongs to a second individual, presumably the murderer, if murder has been committed. It reminds me of the circumstances of the death of Van Jansen in Utrecht in the year 34. Do you remember the case, Gregson?" "No, sir." "Read it up, you really should. There's nothing new under the sun. It's all been done before." As he spoke, his fingers were flying here, there, and everywhere, feeling, pressing, unbuttoning, examining, while his eyes wore the same far-away expression which I have already remarked upon. So swiftly was the examination made that one would hardly have guessed the punctuality with which it was conducted. Finally, he sniffed the dead man's lips, and then glanced at the soles of his patent leather boots. "He has not been moved at all?" he asked. "No more than was necessary for the purposes of our examination." "You can take him to the mortuary now," he said. "There is nothing more to be learned." Gregson had a stretcher and 4 men at hand. At his call they entered the room, and the stranger was lifted and carried out. As they raised him, a ring fell down and rolled across the floor. Lestrade picked it up and stared at it with interested eyes. "There's been a woman here," he cried. "It's a woman's wedding ring." He held it out as he spoke upon the palm of his hand. We all gathered round him and gazed at it. There could be no doubt that this ring of plain gold had once been on the finger of a bride. "This complicates matters," said Gregson. "Heaven knows they were complicated enough before." "You're sure it doesn't simplify them?" observed Holmes. "There's nothing to be learned by staring at it. What did you find in his pockets?" "We have it all here," said Gregson, pointing to the objects on the bottom step of the stairs. "A gold watch, number 97163, by Borough of London. Gold Albert chain, very heavy and solid. Gold ring with Masonic symbol. Gold pin, bulldog's head, with rubies as eyes. Russian leather card case with cards of Enoch J. Drebber of Cleveland, corresponding with E.J.D. upon the linen. No purse, but £7.13 in his pocket. Pocket edition of Boccaccio's Decameron, with name of Joseph Stangerson on the first page. 2 letters, one addressed to E.J. Drebber and one to Joseph Stangerson." "At what address?" "American Exchange, Strand, to be left to call for. They are both from the Guion Steamship Company, and refer to the sailing of their boats from Liverpool." It's clear that this unfortunate man was about to return to New York. "Have you made any inquiries as to this man, Stangerson?" "I did it at once, sir," said Gregson. "I have had advertisements sent to all the newspapers, and one of my men has gone to the American Exchange, but he's not returned yet." "Have you sent to Cleveland?" "We telegraphed this morning." "How did you word your inquiries?" "We simply detailed the circumstances and said that we should be glad of any information which could help us." "You did not ask for particulars on any point which appeared to you to be important?" "I asked about Stangerson." "Nothing else? Is there no strange circumstance in this case? Will you not telegraph again?" "I've said all I have to say," said Gregson, in an offended voice. Sherlock Holmes chuckled to himself and appeared to make some remark, when Lestrade, who had been in the front room while we were holding this conversation in the hall, reappeared upon the scene, rubbing his hands in a self-satisfied manner. "Mr. Gregson," he said, "I have just made a discovery of the highest importance, and one which would have been overlooked if I had not made a careful examination of the walls." The little man's eyes sparkled as he spoke, and he was evidently in a state of suppressed exultation. "Come here," he said, going back into the room, the atmosphere of which felt clearer since the removal of the body. "Now stand there." He struck a match on his boot and held it up against the wall. "Look at that," he said triumphantly. I have remarked that the paper had fallen away in parts. In this particular corner of the room a large piece had come off, leaving a yellow square of coarse plaster. Across this bare space there was scrawled, in blood-red letters, a single word: R-A-C-H-E. "What do you think of that?" cried the detective, with the air of a showman exhibiting his show. "This was overlooked because it was in the darkest corner of the room, and no one thought of looking there."
The murderer has written it with his own or her own blood. See this stain where it has run down the wall? That leaves out the idea of suicide anyhow. Why was that corner chosen to write it on? I will tell you. See that candle on the mantelpiece? It was lit at the time, and if it was lit, this corner would be the brightest instead of the darkest part of the wall.
Well, you have found it, but what does it mean? Asked Gregson.
Mean? Why? It means that the writer was going to put the female name Rachel, but was disturbed before he or she had time to finish. You mark my words, when this case comes to be cleared up, you will find that the woman named Rachel has something to do with it. It's all very well for you to laugh, Mr. Sherlock Holmes. You may be very smart and clever, but the old hound is the best when all is said and done.
I really beg your pardon, said my companion, who had stirred the little man's temper by bursting into laughter. You certainly have the credit of being the first of us to find this out, and, as you say, it bears every mark of having been written by the other participant in last night's mystery. I have not had time to examine this room yet, but, with your permission, I shall do so now. As he spoke, he took a tape measure and a large round magnifying glass from his pocket. With these two instruments, he walked noiselessly about the room, sometimes stopping, occasionally kneeling, and once lying flat upon his face. He was so engrossed with his occupation that he appeared to have forgotten our presence. He chattered to himself under his breath all the time, uttering exclamations, groans, whistles, and little cries of encouragement and hope. As I watched him, I was reminded of a pure-blooded, well-trained foxhound running backwards and forwards until it comes across the lost scent. For 20 minutes or more he continued his researches, measuring with the most exact care the distance between marks which were entirely invisible to me, and occasionally applying his tape to the walls in an incomprehensible manner. In one place he gathered up very carefully a little pile of grey dust from the floor and packed it away in an envelope. Finally, he examined with his glass the word upon the wall, going over every letter of it with the utmost exactness. This done, he appeared to be satisfied, for he put his tape and his glass in his pocket. They say that genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains, he remarked with a smile. It's a very bad definition, but it does apply to detective work. Gregson and Lestrade had watched the actions of their amateur companion with considerable curiosity and some contempt. They evidently failed to appreciate the fact, which I had begun to realize, that all Sherlock Holmes did was directed towards some definite and practical end. "What do you think of it, sir?" they both asked. "I would rob you of the credit of the case if I helped you," remarked my friend. "You are doing so well now that it would be a pity for anyone to interfere." There was a world of sarcasm in his voice as he spoke. "If you will let me know how your investigations go," he continued, "I shall be happy to give you any help I can. In the meantime, I should like to speak to the constable who found the body. Can you give me his name and address?" Lestrade glanced at his notebook. "John Rance," he said. "He's off duty now. You will find him at 46 Audley Court, Kennington Park Gate." Holmes took note of the address. "Come along, Doctor," he said. "We shall go and look him up. I'll tell you one thing which may help you in the case," he said, turning to the two detectives. "There has been murder done, and the murderer was a man. He was more than 6 feet high, in the prime of life, had small feet for his height, wore coarse, square-toed boots, and smoked an Indian cigar. He came here with his victim in a four-wheeled cab, which was drawn by a horse with 3 old shoes and 1 new one on his foreleg. In all probability, the murderer had a red face, and the fingernails of his right hand were remarkably long. These are only a few of the indications, but they may help you." Lestrade and Gregson glanced at each other with an incredulous smile. "If this man was murdered, how was it done?" asked the former. "Poison," said Sherlock Holmes shortly, and went off. "One other thing, Lestrade," he added, turning round at the door. "Rache is the German for revenge. So don't lose your time looking for Miss Rachel." With these words he walked away, leaving the 2 rivals open-mouthed behind him. Chapter 4. What John Rance Had to Tell. It was 1 o'clock when we left No. 3 Lauriston Gardens. Sherlock Holmes led me to the nearest telegraph office, whence he sent a long telegram. He then called a cab and ordered the driver to take us to the address given us by Lestrade. "There's nothing like first-hand evidence," he remarked. "As a matter of fact, my mind is entirely made up upon the case, but still we may as well learn all there is to be learned." "You amaze me, Holmes," said I. "Surely you are not as sure as you pretend to be of all those details which you gave." "There's no mistake," he answered. "The very first thing which I observed on arriving there was that a cab had made 2 lines with its wheels close to the curb. Up to last night we have had no rain for a week, so those wheels which left such deep lines must have been there during the night. There were the marks of the horse's shoes too. The mark of 1 shoe was more clearly cut than of the other 3, showing that it was a new shoe. Since the cab was there after the